State and the New America Foundation and Arizona State University. I wanted to welcome you to what I think is going to be a really interesting conference today. Warring Futures, let me read the whole title, Warring Futures, How Biotech and Robotics Are Transforming Today's Military and How That Will Change the Rest of Us, is a part of a collaboration among Slate, New America, and Arizona State called Future Tense. And it may seem unlikely that you have an internet magazine and a research think tank foundation in Washington and a Western research university collaborating on anything. It's not immediately a sort of understandable synergy. But I think that what's important here, these three institutions share something, or they share two things, which I think is important and why we're gathered here. And that is the idea of future tense is to identify, to ferret out, to root out the unexpected large challenges that the United States and the world face now and judging from its name, in the future. And then these three institutions, I think, are brilliantly positioned to use creative solutions, sort of intellectual vitality, great enthusiasm to come up with unusual, interesting, provocative, important ideas for trying to ameliorate, improve, redress, fix these problems that we face. And in particular, we're interested in how technology sort of adds to the problems that we face, and then how technology can provide unexpected solutions to these problems. It's a collaboration that I think we're looking forward to developing over the next year. And it brings together the writers and editors of Slate, the researchers at New America, the professors and researchers at Arizona State. And it also brings together, and I think this is where it could be a very powerful collaboration, the audiences of these three institutions. So in Slate, you have a magazine that reaches millions and millions of readers all across the country and across the world. In New America, you have an institution whose work is read by the most important policymakers and thinkers in the country. And in Arizona State, you have work that is read by the most important policymakers and thinkers around the country. And you also have students who were associated with the university. And I think the coming together of these three networks of audiences is going to be just as important as the coming together of the people creating the ideas, the people you'll hear from today. So we're going to kick off this collaboration today with what I think is going to be a totally fascinating series of talks. We're not quite at Terminator stage yet in this field, but we're getting there very, very, very quickly. As if you had a chance to take a look at the robots that are floating around here and buzzing around here and walking around here from Aurora and iRobot. Those robots are going to be here all day, by the way, so if you haven't had a chance to play with one yet, you will. You'll get a chance. But this is the field of technological change in the military, in particular with robotics and biotech, that is incredibly fast-moving and interesting, and I think we have a panel of speakers today who are uniquely positioned to explain what this means and how it will change the military and how it will change us. Just to give a brief guide to the shape of the day, we're going to start in a moment with a panel about exactly what this technological change is, and you're going to get to see some robots, the friendly kind of robots, not the man-killing robots. So we'll see some friendly. Do we have the man killers too? Okay. So anyone who's on their cell phone during that, the man killer will be looking for you. And then after that panel, we'll have a short break, and then we'll have another panel which is about how this technology is affecting today's military. Then we're going to have a lunch, and George Post from Arizona State is going to give what looks to be totally mesmerizing talk during lunch. And then after lunch, we'll have a final panel, a discussion of how these technologies are going to filter out into greater society and change the rest of us too. So just a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Steve. One, we're on C-SPAN. We're also live streaming this on the web. So this is all on the record, and there are cameras around, so be aware of that. Please silence your cell phones if you haven't already, and ask lots of interesting questions. And thank you very much for coming. And I'll turn it over to Steve Call from the New America Foundation.
Thank you, David. If I could invite the panelists from the first on the first panel to come up and sit down, I'll introduce you as you're moving and get us moving quickly. Just to set the stage before I give you a quick glimpse of the biographies of the people you'll be hearing from first. As David said, my name is Steve Call, by the way. I'm the president of the New America Foundation. We have really enjoyed this collaboration with Slate and Arizona State alike, and very much looking forward to the day. The way this panel is going to work, each of the panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, maybe 12, and then I'll perhaps try to provoke some conversation among them, and then I'll make sure there's time to take questions from you. The first speaker will address primarily the robotic subject, the second, emergent biological insights that affect military strategy and soldiering, and then the third speaker is going to try to talk about what my colleague Joel Garreau calls the marriage of hardware and wetware, meaning essentially kinetic telepathy, as I understand it. And I'm not even sure I can go much beyond that in describing it. So and then we'll try to see what the common threads and discourse within those three presentations is after they're made. Our first speaker is Vice Admiral Joseph Dyer, who is the president of the Government and Industrial Robots Division at IRobot. Now, you've seen his character in the movies, played by Willem Dafoe. He usually dies violently at the end of the film. But we expect a benign version of that from the Admiral. He also chairs NASA's Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel. He had a long distinguished career in the Navy that included command of the Naval Air Systems Command, and was the Naval Aviation Systems Chief Engineer, so you can imagine his talents. After him will come John Mogford, who is the Acting Deputy Director of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. He's previously a research professor at Northwestern University, and he has a PhD in medical sciences from Texas A&M. And finally, Stephen Helms-Tillery, who is Assistant Professor at the Harrington Department of Bioengineering at Arizona State. He has also worked in the Department of Kinesiology at ASU, and he has a doctorate in neuroscience from the University of Minnesota. So with that, let me invite Vice Admiral Dyer to the podium. I'm going to retire until the three presentations are done, and then I'll return as your moderator. Admiral.
You have to watch these fellows. How they can always find the tallest redhead in the group is an absolute mystery to me. And they're not above sucking up. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here today. You know, you should take a little bit of time every once in a while to look into the future. And great minds ought to come together and try and do that, and I'm very, very impressed with the group that's here today, both in the audience and those and fellow speakers. I'll tell you a little bit about IRobot just to get started. IRobot's a spin out of MIT. It's a publicly traded company. About 350 million top-line revenue this year. I tell you that just to give you a feel that robotics is becoming a real business as well as a real technology. Speaking of disruptive technologies, I think it might be instructive to give just a moment's thought to what is a disruptive technology. The first thing that I would offer on the slide to my right is that there really haven't been that many of them. Certainly fire and the wheel and alphabets, electricity, oil, and now biotech and robotics and perhaps nanotech. A number of messages there. One of the messages is, what is the next big thing for America? We did well with agriculture. We did very well with automobiles. We certainly did well with computers and IT. What is the next big thing? And certainly robotics and biotech, many of us think, represents an opportunity to do just that. But let's take fire for a minute and drill down into what it means to be a disruptive technology. I would offer to you that before fire, they ate us, and after fire, we ate them. This is perhaps as crisp a definition as I could offer about a disruptive technology. Robotics has for many, many years resided on the left-hand side of some wonderful work depicted here by Jeffrey Moore that talks about crossing the chasm. Crossing the chasm from innovators and early adopters, where robots have lived for years and years, and making their way into the early majority. Robots are really doing that today in an interesting reversal of history. For many, many years, certainly, John, as you would recall, the military-led technology. Then we saw a reversal where the marketplace, certainly in the IT world, carried technological advancements, and to some extent the military followed. But it is the IED threat and the need to counter it, to get space between our sons and daughters and improvised explosive devices, that has really accelerated the adoption of robots. At IRobot, and I say this with the acknowledged sense of pride, at IRobot we get postcards from young men and women serving in Iraq and Afghanistan that say, "You saved lives today. You saved lives today." It just doesn't get any better than that, to be able to work at the leading edge of technology, but also to be contributing to the survival of our military men and women. Let's talk just a little bit about developing markets, because I've always been a little geeky, like probably most of my panel members here. But I also believe if you're not fielding, you're failing. If you're not delivering technology to the marketplace, then it's a pedagogic exercise, and I'm interested in that transition across the chasm. You'll see depicted here the fact that it took UAVs, it took unmanned aerial vehicles, over 20 years to reach a $500 million market. UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, have done the same, have reached a $500 million market in less than 10 years, about half the time. And confidently, unmanned underwater vehicles and other vehicles are going to follow in time. That long maturation of UAVs, true for several reasons. One of which was, quite frankly, the pilots' white scarf union. I know, I was a member. But also the fact that it was first up. Unmanned systems have found real traction in today's battlefield and are going to find more and more traction in our lives as we go forward. The first real modeling and simulation that's been so useful in aviation is finding its way into robotics as well. The product of that modeling and simulation shows us that enemy kills beyond line of sight are increased by a factor of 15 with the presence of a robot. Friendly losses reduced by more than half, and enemy losses can be both accelerated and minimized at the same time. A long story, perhaps we could talk about that later. Give you a little look at robots at work here. Robots today are primarily teleoperated. There's someone who's head down, butt up, operating the robot behind the scenes, and the primary product that robots bring today is to get distance between you and bad things. But they're also becoming very, very quickly accelerating, and new technologies and the advent of autonomy. Robots that are smarter, that can think about many tasks on their own, are being developed. Now that's coming on initially in very simple fashion. It's coming on in terms of robots that if they lose communications today, you have to go out and get them. The first simple advent of autonomy is to say to the robot, or for the robot to say, gee, if I can't talk anymore, maybe I should go back to where I could talk the last time. Things like what we call cruise control. Today you have to operate or direct or drive robots every step of the way. But in the future, we'll have the equivalent of cruise control that says just maintain your vector unless I tell you to do something else. In our laboratories today, both government laboratories and at IRobot, we're starting to see click-to-drive robots that can build maps with flash lidars, robots that can correlate metadata between the sensor array, between geospatial location with video and smart video enhancements. And they do so with tremendous mobility, both inside and outside, and always delivering that distance between harm's way and the product. Let me talk a little bit about advanced technologies and where they're going. We're seeing already the increased presence on the battlefield. Some 9,000 robots, if you count all the different kinds of ground robots in service in Iraq and Afghanistan today. They're tools today. They're an extension of self, but they're going to be full-up teammates with the ability to carry out actions on their own, and we see our way some 10 or 12 years downstream to organizational tasks that can be taken up with robots. Certainly enabling technologies of sensors and behaviors and autonomy. And today's operations are one of one robot operator and one robot. In our laboratories and in the beginning of initial trials are small swarms of robots. IRobot was one of the leaders in DARPA's swarm work of late 90s, early 2000. That's now down to taking those algorithms developed with hundreds of robots and pragmatically applying them to 2, 3, 4, a dozen robots where you have one operator and multiple robots under that command. So we're starting to see many on many, and we're going to start to see cloud-like operations. Talk a little bit through that timeline for you. Down on the left is today's teleoperated robot, like those that you see here. If you want to open a door or blast through a door or tear down a door with today's robots, you have to operate motors and actuators to do that which you would do with your hand if you could get that close. In the future, we're going to see deployed, because we see in the laboratory today robots with whom you can communicate with gesture and with voice. Robots that you can say, breach the door, and they will accept that task and carry out that task without the direction of individual actuators and motors. They accept an assignment and they'll execute it. Further downstream, the ability to take on logistics missions in a large organizational sense will be there. The ability to get huge amounts of fuel to distant areas without having to send folks along with it. Robots are going to be an omnipresent part of our lives. So they're going to be much, much bigger than the military, and I wanted to talk about that just a little bit. How many of you have a Roomba, our little robotic vacuum? Have any Roomba owners here? First of all, get with the program, please. 5 million Roombas have been sold around the world. accelerating every day, and it is a fully autonomous robot in the home. Pool cleaners are coming, scrubbers are cleaning, many different home applications, and it will marry very nicely with a smart home. We've talked about military activities in unmanned air, unmanned ground, and unmanned underwater. The next exciting thing we believe there is a quick expansion in underwater capabilities and the integration of all unmanned systems such that you get 4 pi stir radian of coverage in a complete sphere around you. Healthcare is a tremendous opportunity, and I would tell you necessity for robots. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Energy, oil, farming, toys, construction, you're going to see robots throughout your life. Let's look at some demographics for just a minute. On this chart, if you look on the right side, the red side, those are females, and to the left in the blue are males. And you see stacked up by age the distribution of population in Europe in 1950. Now, I use Europe because I wanted to, given the theme of this conference, to take a look at that notch that's out of the middle, of the distribution at 30 to 34 years. You know what that notch is? World War II. You can see the tremendous carnage that a global war can have on a population. But that's not the main point I wanted to make. Look at that distribution of young working folks supporting a tight little cadre of senior citizens, 1950. Let's look at 2000, and you can start to see the baby boom generation, my generation, walking through the distribution almost like a pig through a python. And if you extrapolate out to 2050, you can see a dramatic challenge for economies and for our families. We think robots will have a tremendous opportunity to contribute to this. How? Well, by being a virtual and remote presence for the delivery of medical care, to be able to deliver meds, to be able to be a modern equivalent of I've fallen and I cannot get up. We're talking robots that, with a combination of voice over IP, smart video, and mobility, will say, hey, Fred, your mom ought to be vertical this time of day. She's horizontal. She hasn't moved in 5 minutes. I thought I ought to call you. Very different approach than currently in Japan. Japan is on the unfortunate cutting edge of this shift in demographics, and they're actually now outsourcing their elderly to the Philippines. So an opportunity for robots to contribute dramatically in elder care. I want to make 2 points with this next to the last chart. The first is, why is this hard? And the second is to say, don't believe everything you see at the movies. If you see the column casting a shadow across the checkerboard, I'm going to convince you here in just a second that those 2 squares, the dark one at top and the light gray one down below, I'm going to convince you that those 2 squares are the same color. Want to see that again? They look very different, don't they, to your mind, to our minds, but they're not. Why is that? That's because context, our encoded understanding of what a checkerboard looks like, misleads us. We think we know, we're sure we know, but it's absolutely wrong. So 2 messages there. The first is, robots have still to overcome the challenge of vision within context. And the second is, lots of things happen in the movies that you shouldn't believe, but it is going to be a very, very exciting time. I'll preempt one question I've already gotten at the coffee table. When will we have a full-up Android male or female assistant that you would go out and have a beer with? 2035 is our answer to that. By the way, we think that's about right, that you'll see biped practical biped mobility, that you'll see advanced artificial intelligence, and that you'll have a real home helpmate some 25 years into the future. I put up my email address and my cell phone. I will tell you one of the very exciting things about IRobot and about robots in general is that we've increased our workforce by almost 20 to 23%. Even during this last 18 months or so, we are looking for wonderful people, computer scientists, for mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, good analysts, people that can work on tactics and doctrine as well as hardware and software. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to spend some time with you today.
Good morning. My name is John Mockford. I'm the Deputy Director of the Defense Sciences Office at DARPA. And let me start off by saying that it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers. And it's also an honor to represent a number of program managers at DARPA whose work I'll be showing this morning. So I was asked to speak to, at least within the DARPA world, some of the things that we think are coming down the pipe in terms of bio. So this would fit into the biotech portion of this morning's panel. As many of you know, DARPA is the lead R&D agency of the Department of Defense. We're not attached to any specific service, but we work with all the services. Going into a description of the programs that you'll see, what I'd like to do is to challenge you to think of the dual use of all of these programs. So not only certainly the D in DARPA is for defense, and that's who our customer is, but it's important that it's important for us, and we work very hard in this space to find civilian applications because as I like to think that we're not the greatest market in the world, and to ensure availability of some of these technologies, to have a civilian play is critical. What I'll be showing is somewhat our organization of the programs. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this other than to say this is just how we bend things. So moving into biological warfare defense programs, the other part will be what we call tactical biomedical programs, or activities which fall more in the space of trauma care, rehabilitation, and hardening of individuals before going into harm's way. Within the biological warfare defense, which you can think of as either Mother Nature or human engineered, we slice the pie into pathogen-directed countermeasures and host-directed countermeasures, and then running across the x-axis you see from programs from prediction all the way out to therapeutic development, treatment, and hardening of immune systems. So the first program I'll mention is called Accelerated Manufacturing of Pharmaceuticals. And this is in essence plant-based expression systems for proteins. And if you consider that a vaccine is a protein, what you have are plant-based vaccine manufacturing capabilities. The upside here are the positive attributes that they're rapid. There's no need for chicken eggs, so you have no reliance on a source of special chicken eggs. You're just relying on the growth of tobacco plants. So there is an upside to use of tobacco. These are not genetically modified. The point here is that it's built for speed. You don't want to genetically modify these. You just want to take over the protein production system in the plants. Again, quick, inexpensive, pennies per dose, and it's fully automated, and that goes somewhat to the manufacturing requirements set up by the regulatory folks over at the FDA. But to put this in context of reality, and some of the things I'll show you are here and now, and are real, and some of the other things I'll show you coming up are much more embryonic in nature, but I think will give a flavor for things to come. So last year we reacted quickly to, once we got the sequence from the H1N1 California, the swine flu last year, we quickly demonstrated the production of a vaccine candidate, so protein, that was immunogenic in preclinical models. The plants have also expressed 17 different protein targets, including 13 different hemagglutinins, and that's the target within flu. That's the H in the H1N1. And we've demonstrated scalability up to 100-fold. So we're looking at, and I think folks should find it palatable, that you can produce hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines per month in plant-based pharmaceuticals. DARPA has been playing in this space since about 2005, but a number of other groups are going this direction, and plant-based systems have been around for a few decades. Along with the AMP program in that vaccine space is in essence a human immune system in a dish, which we call the Modular Immune in Vitro Construct, or MIMIC for short. This came out of a program that started in the early part of this decade with the attempt to take the animals and the human testing out of therapeutics development, vaccine development, again, built for speed, built for broad-based testing of populations without exposing individuals to vaccines or candidate therapeutics. So what you see there on the right-hand side is a 96-well plate in which you can have up to 30 to 40 individuals' immune systems and gauge a response to a candidate protein based on how that immune system responds. So you can measure, well, is that protein wiping out the cells of this immune system, which would certainly not be a good thing. Are they responding in the right way? Are they producing antibodies in response to the protein? This is spreading out. This is a fairly mature, I'll even call it a product, from Vax Design that's being used both in the European Union and the United States for assessment of therapeutic candidates. The next one in the biological warfare defense space, and this is a relatively new program kicked off in, I think, 2008, and I think highlights the speed with which some of our programs go. But the Predicting Health and Disease program was established to determine that once exposed to a pathogen, will you get sick? And can we determine if you're going to get sick before you ever show a symptom? So if you think of the importance of that, the offloading of medical assets, the fine-tuned use of medicines, and the movement of folks that aren't going to get sick out of emergency rooms. This is something that could have a very a large impact on the response to a pandemic event, for example. What you see in the bottom left-hand corner are the predictions of both positive predictive power, negative predictive power. So was there a false alarm, in essence, to rhinovirus, respiratory syncytial virus, and influenza A, or H3N2. So 3 different viruses, all clinically relevant, rhinovirus being the common cold. And what you see in the red bars is at 0.1 T. So if T is the time at which you show symptoms, 0 is the moment that you're exposed to the virus. So a tenth of the way through that timeline, with 85% power, we can tell if you're going to get sick. And that's a pretty powerful set of data there. Now, the other beautiful thing here is that you can distinguish between the virus that you've been exposed to. Again, a way to direct therapies and clinical response. So the takeaway from this is that with this system like this, which again is based on how the human responds to the pathogen, it's not based on the pathogen, but you will be able to tell who will get sick, who will not get sick, who will not get sick but will spread the disease. So a very powerful capability that was stood up very rapidly and certainly could be implemented very quickly. This is a simple PCR-based, which is a standard laboratory technique that's practiced all over the country millions of times today, both in the clinical space and the research space. So a very simple technology, but important outcome. So moving into the tactical biomedical technologies, most of this sits within what we like to think of as trauma care, but it's really everything from resilience and warfighter readiness all the way to rehabilitation and return either to duty or to civilian life. And again, we think of these things in terms of preparation and training, survivability, care and restoration. Certainly the lead program in this space for us is the Revolutionizing Prosthetics program, led by Colonel Jeff Ling. Since this has been on 60 Minutes, and in the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time here. But what I will say is that we're moving rapidly to clinical trials for both the strap-on device that was developed by DECA and also to a neurally integrated, which is a nice segue to the next talk, very rapidly. So again, this program started in 2006. And over the next 18 months, we'll be moving into clinical trials, and I think is a point of pride for the nation for this program to move so quickly. And kudos to Colonel Ling and his team. So let me move into a couple of programs that probably receive less attention compared to the prosthesis program, which I think is appropriate. But in terms of less mature examples of what I think are coming down the pipe in terms of biotech. I think that DARPA has been a leader in both of these spaces. I don't think necessarily that we will bring these to full maturity as is normal, but we certainly, that's the intent. So the first one's called blood farming. The short takeaway here is to take the blood donor out of the blood supply system. So to develop a stem cell based bioreactor production system for universal donor red blood cells. The universal donor red blood cell is interchangeable with platelets, white blood cells, whatever cell type that you want to develop out of the stem cell. The stem cell source really is almost irrelevant, just that you can efficiently and quickly and cost effectively drive it down the pathway to the cell type that you want. In this case, again, we're going for universal donor red blood cells. You can think of it as a laboratory-based industrial production, a device that produces red blood cells. The hope is that this would kind of stabilize supply, greatly reduce the transmission of disease through the blood supply. There's no or reduced incidence of storage lesion. We believe this refers to degradation of the cells that occurs when you store them either frozen or fresh or refrigerated, I mean. So the comparison here is what we're trying to capture is the way that humans do it. So every second, every one of us is producing about 2 million red blood cells. So every second. So that's an unbelievable amount of production. And we're trying to capture that by, in essence, looking at how we do it, finding that stem cell niche. How do stem cells go down this pathway from a pluripotent state to a mature red blood cell? The upside here for us with red blood cells is this: for the stem cell world, this is probably the best studied pathway that there is. This pathway has been well documented for 2 or 3 decades now. So if you take this path in humans in our bone marrow, going from our blood stem cells out to packaged red blood cells, which of course would require a blood donation, and transferring this into a bioreactor that takes the stem cell, puts it in the right environment, and pumps out red blood cells. So what you see here is a bag of farmed red blood cells, and to show that there's some reality here, this is the device, and what you're seeing here is in essence the growth chamber. This is the bioreactor in which the cells reside. The tubing in and out are nutrients, gas supply, pH, everything that's happening in our bone marrow right now. So temperature controlled, all the appropriate nutrients. The cells at the appropriate time then leave. You can see the scale from the individual's hands right there. Moves to an isolation chamber based on magnetic field, so you take advantage of the magnetic properties of red blood cells, whether you load them with oxygen or deoxygenate them. You can play the trick with the paramagnetic, diamagnetic properties of the cells to isolate the mature red blood cells that are expressing hemoglobin. That's the isolation device, and then off into what is a standard blood bag. So this is a research unit, but it's something real. It's something that we've moved into phase 2 in the program. The intent is that within 24 to 36 months, moving into human clinical trials with the cells that are coming out of this machine. So again, back to the dual use, you can think of the applications both in areas of the globe with tainted blood supplies. The other probably less well appreciated application here is and for what it's being partly used for is in malaria research. The challenge with malaria is the red blood cells that are infected by the parasite are immature red blood cells. There's very few of them that are circulating in our systems. The cells that are coming out of this right now are those kind of immature red blood cells. So we're shipping our cells, in essence our trash, so to speak, over to the malaria researchers at Walter Reed, and they're using it as a culture system to test drugs to treat malaria, which is a patient population of about 2.3 billion people. The final one is feedback regulated automatic molecular release, which is a mouthful, so I'll just call it the FRAMER program. And this is a need responsive drug delivery system. So the concept here is that you have a biomaterial that can circulate in our bloodstream as a depot of drug that would release the drug only when needed, and once no longer needed would turn off the release of that drug, and then you would have an on and off system. So we looked at this, and the proof of concept, if you will, was the release of morphine and the counter drug naloxone, which is used to treat overdoses of morphine. So if you will, at the bottom shows the real world, which would be all of us. So all of our responses to a drug is variable. Some of us will sit within the therapeutic window. That same dose will be an underdose for me or an overdose for someone else. The concept here is to develop a biomaterial that responds to the physiological need of the patient and releases the amount of drug that's needed. So if you look in the case here again, morphine and naloxone, when you give morphine, if you overdose with morphine, you will enter into respiratory depression. If you follow the linear thinking here, respiratory depression drops the oxygen content in your blood or increases the CO2 content in your blood. That's the signal that's used by the biomaterials that are circulating to release naloxone or not release naloxone. And so we have certainly achieved that in preclinical models of entering into a hypoxic state from our low oxygen state, having naloxone released from the biomaterial that's circulating. Then once the respiratory depression is corrected by naloxone, the release is turned off, turns on and off. And these things circulate for 18 to 24 hours. So if you replace naloxone and morphine with any drug type, pain, inflammation, cancer, on, you can see the dual use applications and a very specific and true personalized medicine that is automated within these materials. So with that, I'll stop there and yield the floor.
And then you want that one first, right? Yes. This one, go ahead.
That 1 second.
Okay, thank you. And you can full screen if you want. Yeah.
Well, this is pretty interesting. My name is Steve Helms-Tillery. I'm a professor at Arizona State University. I guess I'm talking about telekinetic monkeys. After watching the robots this morning, I'm sort of wishing I had brought flying monkeys instead. I guess I was really invited here to talk about the interface between biology and technology. And in particular, I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm going to be talking at a relatively limited scope about the interface between the nervous system and some kind of technological system. And to make any kind of marriage of that sort where you have the nervous system making use of some kind of technological device, you need really 3 elements. The first 2 elements are that you need to have a good enough understanding of the nervous system, of the brain itself. What's the brain doing? How's it operating? How's it learning? How's it carrying out things? And then the second part you need is good technology. And so we sort of learned enough about how the brain controls arm movements, for example. So I'm going to really focus on arm movements here because the lab I work in is mostly sort of a prosthetics lab. We're interested in maybe controlling a prosthetic limb from brain signals. So in about 1980, there was a series of papers published that developed what you might call a decoding scheme, so that if you had some kind of good high-fidelity signal from a large number of neurons in the brain, and that large number actually was 80 to 100, you had some ability then to take those signals and make an estimate of what you were going to do with your arm. Okay, well that was in the 1980s, and in the 1980s there were some limits to the technology, mainly that we could essentially record 1 or 2 or 3 of those signals at once rather than 100 of those signals at once. and that we also didn't really have the computing power that we needed to take those signals, do this decoding scheme, and turn that into some kind of a real control algorithm. So that waited for about 20 years. And in the late 1990s, essentially 4 groups at once realized that the technologies were all in place. We had good enough technologies to record lots of signals simultaneously from the brain, good, fast computers that we could use to turn that signal into some kind of a unified control signal, and then from that estimate what was going on with the arm. So the first video I'm going to show you here is essentially, in effect, it's kind of mind reading with a monkey. Okay, so on the right side of the screen here, you're going to see it's a monkey's hand, and he's just pushing buttons with his hand. And on the left side of the screen, there's a robot. So in between the two, the robot's in a totally separate room. In between the two, what's going on here is we're recording the signals from about 40 neurons, taking those signals, processing them through a computer, trying to essentially read out what the monkey is doing with his arm based purely on those neural signals, pumping it to another computer, which is now running this robotic arm and then running the robot arm. And so what you should be able to see in this video is that the monkey pushes the button, and as he reaches from one button to the next, the robot can kind of parallel that movement. Right? So the other thing that you should be able to see about this is that the robot we can actually launch the robot before the monkey moves his hand. Okay, so all this really tells us at this point is that we have the technology in place, we understand enough about how the brain controls movement, and we have the technology in place to take those signals out of the brain, do a very rapid estimate, and use that estimate to tell us somewhere else what the monkey is doing with his arm. Okay, if you're in a prosthetics lab like I'm in, that's kind of cool, but who really needs to read a monkey's mind? I mean, really what we want to do is turn it around and give the monkey a tool that he can use so that he can control something. I mean, if you have a prosthetic arm, it's nice if you can kind of read out the person's intention, but it's much nicer if the person can actually use the arm to do something, right? Okay, so I'm going to show you the next video here. And this is from this video is about 6 months ago. Hello? All different applications, turn all these different videos. Okay, so this is almost doing exactly the same thing. So we have a series of electrodes, and there was a series of electrodes shown in the revolutionizing prosthetics. That's what we have here. So rather than 30 neurons, this monkey now is we're recording cells from about 200 neurons. And rather than trying to read the monkey's mind, now we've given the monkey the robot. So the monkey is actually looking at this robot. The perspective is a little odd. I apologize for that. But the monkey is actually volitionally controlling this robot. So what you're seeing is that there's one robot that's presenting a target. It's got some kind of orientation in space, and the monkey is reaching out with this robot to move and grasp that object. Okay, so this is a much more sophisticated control. The robot arm that he's controlling, instead of just moving the hand, it's actually positioning the entire arm, positioning the hand in space. It's much like you would reach out to grab a squishy robot, for example. Okay, so this is, in terms of sort of capabilities, this is a large advance over the previous video. However, it's not really sort of conceptually a huge advance. And the reason has to do with the third element, which I didn't mention to you. And that third element of making a real interface is the real interface itself. Okay, so we have, in this case, a monkey who's got a device which is essentially a bed of nails that's embedded into the cortex. And this has been done with humans. Some of you may have heard of Matt Nagel, who had the same technology implanted in his cortex. He used it to control a robot arm, to control a smart computer, that kind of thing. Okay, well, there's essentially two problems with that. One has to do with the fact that you penetrate the blood-brain barrier. As soon as you do that, you get a biological response. The body treats that as a foreign object, tries to get rid of it, encapsulate it, cover it with scar tissue, and at some variable period of time, that implant is no longer useful. The second is that to make a system like this, if you want to make a real hand, it's not enough to have a very sort of articulate, highly controlled device. A hand is also a sensor. So I can grab this and tell that this is a soft object, and I can feel that in my fingertips. To do that, we have to put information back into the brain. Okay, so with these kind of devices, we have to do that with electricity. It turns out, with the way electricity flows into the body, that there are sort of inherent limitations with how you can pump information into the brain. And we can add a lot more electrodes, so in this case we can go from 30 to 200 electrodes. Those same inherent limitations exist. So some of you may have know about cochlear implants, for example. And cochlear implants started with one channel and then have advanced up now to 20-some channels. The technology exists to make a cochlear implant that's got, say, 200 channels of stimulation. But it doesn't matter because you can only drive certain kind of patterns of current because of the way current flows in the body. So how do we overcome this limitation? So there's whole new things developing now, and I didn't bring slides to show you because they're so new. I don't really have slides to show you. So turns out, for example, using modern molecular biology, we can do things like take neurons, re-engineer neurons, just your plain old average ordinary neuron, and turn it into a photodetector. So we can re-engineer the entire cortex if we want, so that all those neurons respond to light. So now you can imagine, instead of passing current into the brain, maybe you can put like a little tiny HD TV on the brain. So all the neurons respond to light. Instead of passing current, you put little very focused patterns of light on the brain and play in patterns of activity. Well, as soon as you can do that, now you can maybe generate like really fine sensation. You could get in there and direct contact with a fingertip, give information about sensual touch. Okay, that means we have an input-output device. So that's kind of, this is essentially what all the groups right now are working on, is coming up with ways to turn these output systems also into input systems. So as soon as you have an input-output device, now I'm going to tread a little bit into unfamiliar territory because I don't really think about military stuff all that often, being more of a biomedical researcher. But as soon as you have an input-output system, who's to say what kind of information you can put into the brain? It becomes possible now to say, provide information rather than talking. It may be possible to be like the Matrix and provide like a sort of a focused piece of information into the brain about some context. Or how about network brains? Maybe we can have a whole series of brains together interfacing through wireless connections, communicating very rapidly without talking. I think the sort of the possibilities of the input-output elements of this technology are pretty interesting and staggering. And we're essentially right here, right now. This is the thing that's right on the horizon in neuroprosthetics. So I'll yield with that. Thank you.
Those two other questions. But before I turn to that, I want to extend your forecasting a little bit, and particularly ask John and the others of you, because Stephen commented at the end of his presentation. John, your presentation focused on defensive innovations and remedial palliative innovations. In the future, do you expect on the offensive side, without reference to perhaps what exactly you're doing in this space, but thinking about other nations, where the technology is pointing us, a general forecast, do you expect fielded soldiers in 20 years or 30 years to be biologically enhanced in some way that increases their capability or creates military dilemmas?
Well, perhaps in some ways that's done now with narcotics. Certainly, we know some of our adversaries. Somalia is a classic example. But I would say, yeah, in 20 years, sure, that's not an unreasonable time frame.
And do you think, though, that those capabilities are going to be as potentially transformative as some of the defensive capabilities that you were describing, or are they just going to be marginal improvements in the ability of a fielded soldier to stay awake or to see precisely?
We'll probably view them as marginal. I think at the end of it, it will be seen as evolutionary, incremental versus a revolutionary type of step. Certainly, you can always be surprised. Certainly, our duty is to not be surprised. I would stay with that. If it does happen, it'll be viewed as either expected or incremental.
And Admiral Dyer, I listened with fascination to your presentation, and certainly am not expert in the fields that you've spent your life in as an engineer. And certainly you're correct to observe that the facts tell us that the robotics industry is finally breaking out from early adopters to early majority, to use the paradigm that you put up on a slide. But it took a longer time for that to happen than many people expected. And I would imagine that you're still wrestling with some pretty daunting engineering problems. And I wonder, when you think out about the forecast that you presented and your sense of where we'll be in 2030, as an engineer, honestly, what are the hardest problems that are yet to be conquered? And how does the difficulty of those problems, if it does, implicate the fact that we were so slow getting here? Why were we so slow getting here?
Well, great question. Thank you. It turns out that Moore's law, the law that says that the processing power of a microprocessor doubles roughly every 18 months, has been very good to robotics. And more than anything else, it is that affordable processing power has arrived on the scene concurrent with the emergence of robotics, and you would not be incorrect to say that it is the driver or the foundation for robotics. So processing capability in Moore's law it brings us to today's emerging markets. To look forward and to again overlay the question of affordability, vision is the holy grail of robotics. You can, with a flash lidar, with a laser that broadcasts out, we could map this room, each of you in your positions, each table, and we would have a 3D database. We would be able to go in and measure the distance between you two gentlemen up front here by calling upon that 3D database. That works, but it's expensive. You can take now instead your camera from your cell phones or your PDAs, which, by the way, is running at a cost of goods right now of a little less than $3. If you can instead navigate and perceive with vision rather than flash lidar, then you have a very, very affordable and available market mover that takes robotics ahead. Rodney Brooks, who for many years led the Artificial Intelligence and Computer Science lab at MIT, one of the founders of IRobot. IRobot is a spin-out of MIT. Rod would, to answer your question, would often reach in his pocket and pull out his cell phone. And he would make the point that if you held it up to a 3-year-old child, that he or she would say, cell phone. But you know, they come in many different shapes and different colors and different constructs. For a machine to be able to cross that chasm between the contextual knowledge of a young child to artificial intelligence as we encode it into machines today is still a challenge in front of us. It can be done. The trick will be able to do it at mass market affordability.
That's great. So, Admiral, if I could just stay with you for one more question before we turn it to the audience. Since you're a military man, I want to kind of leap you forward to the next panel since you're not on it and ask a little bit about the impact of these technologies on the battlefield. During your presentation, you alluded to 2 fielded robots, essentially, that are on the battlefield now. Quite a startling number, 9,000 robots in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's probably about 5% of the human fielded forces that the United States has there. That their purpose, so there's 2 sorts of robots, at least engaged in combat settings, aerial drones, and then these ground robots that are assisting in mitigating IEDs. In your presentation, you talked about the role that the ground robots play in creating distance between soldiers and bad stuff. Both the future of those weapon systems and the drones have always raised in the public's mind the fear of, as a non-military person, what I guess I would call fire control. Do these become automated in some way that creates unexpected consequences? My sense of the drone program is that the reverse has actually happened. Because of the sensors and the integrated video and telecommunications capabilities, there are actually more people watching a target through this device than were able to interrogate it before. But are there operational concerns that, as an innovator in this space and a military commander, you're conscious of as these systems become more and more sophisticated?
There's a dissertation in the answer to the to that question, and a little hard to know where to start. But let me say yes, absolutely. There are technical questions and there are ethical questions. You allude to them. Let's back off a little bit and talk about enhancement. Let's talk about what's happening in terms of military robots, and then let's put it in a context of technology writ large. Today's night vision goggles, if you look at any news film from Iraq and Afghanistan, you'll see at least a bracket, and often the actual night vision device mounted on the helmet. You know, to pull back for a minute, this is imparting to today's soldiers the ability to see in the dark via enhancement. So it is coming very rapidly. It's already come, and it is an extension of that. Probably will be the integration rather than the ancillary use of enhancement. Robotics parallels and follows those increased sensory capabilities that human warriors carry. I would say, first of all, don't be so fearful. There's a lot that's not known by the future about the future, and it's always scary. But you know, nothing was as scary as the Combine in the late 19th, early 20th century. Here, for the first time, was technology coming into agriculture that was going to dramatically change the economics, that was going to displace unskilled workers, and was going to ruin society as we know it. You know, it just didn't happen. We, as an evolving people, were able to embrace that technology and able to do wonderful things with it. That trend will continue. Now, let's talk about the exciting change in military robotics today is going from the EOD community, the explosive ordnance disposal community, those specialists that deal with IEDs, and the battlefield is moving quickly in the direction of a tool for infantry, for soldiers, for the big army. By the way, the Army tells us that 52% of the casualties in the United States Army come at first contact with the enemy. Well, that's not a surprise. I mean, that's a quantitative telling of the reason the point man position is never very popular. If you're going to lose 52% of your people in initial contact with the enemy, what a great job for a robot. Now, let's get to your question of killing machines. That's an ethical question. Our position at IRobot is that will we see armed robots? Absolutely, because if you look at the history of any military equipment, it evolves from tactical reconnaissance to the frustration of being able to see but not act to the ability to strike. But we feel strongly that ethically you'll always have to have a man in the loop, a person in the loop, for that question of whether or not you're going to be able to take a life. Would there be any scenarios where you would empower a robot? I don't know, the last protection of the last smallpox virus. I don't know, ready nuclear weapons storage. Nobody ought to be in there anyway. Perhaps, but it's a real stretch, and we just don't see a coming of life and death decisions imparted into machines.
Thank you for that thoughtful and comprehensive answer. Can I ask just the other two of you, before we turn to the audience, if you have anything to offer along these lines? Are there questions of that character, ethical questions presented in the work that you're thinking about, that you sometimes find yourself wrestling with privately or with colleagues?
Well, a guiding principle for myself has always been, in thinking of utilization within the military, is to have within the biotech space for our men and women to return as deployed. So you'll notice that, part of my presentation, there weren't things like gene therapy or enhancement. A genetic biological approach to enhancing night vision. We will certainly look at Mother Nature and see how other organisms do it, replicated perhaps in a device. And that's a very good way to do it. Actually, you're relying on billions of years of Mother Nature to come up with the best ways to get past these challenges. But boiling it down, that's my guiding principle and the agency's guiding principle.
Is that an articulated principle? Because it's a very powerful one that men and women should return as deployed.
when I look at program ideas, it's certainly the first thing that comes through your mind. I mean, certainly, return as deployed. That keeps it very simple.
Yes. Stephen, anything to? Great. Let's take some questions from the audience. Please wait for a microphone. I assume we have some microphones traveling. And identify yourself and ask a crisp question. Remember, you're on camera. Yes.
My name is William Seymour. Thank you very much for talking. I was just curious in respect to some of the things that Dr. Helms-Tillery brought up about sort of the interface with, the human neural interface with mechanical objects. Since machinery is almost infinite in the limits of its improvements, and the human mind and body really aren't, to what extent will these kind of things be limited by humans' inability to process certain amounts of information from, say, visual interfaces, or their ability to handle say, cybernetic attachments that really we can't, as an individual, handle mentally or physically. To what extent would that be limited in its future scope, and would it be possible to perhaps improve human neural interface to handle greater responsibilities?
That's actually a very. Can you hear me here?
I think so.
I think that's a very interesting question, and actually I think it's a very open question. It's not entirely clear to me that that those limitations are entirely sorted out at this point. So, for example, I do some research with scorpions. So a scorpion is very small. It's just got a few neurons, but put a scorpion in a room with a cricket. It'll go over to the cricket, pick up the cricket, identify a spot, put a stinger in there, and then eat the cricket, of course. Okay, so I think if we tasked some computer scientists with finding the cricket, going in, finding exactly the spot to stick that stinger, that it wouldn't be trivial. It would be a difficult task in general. So biology is very good at certain things. Another example is your arm. So the dynamics of the arm are actually fairly complex. And so writing computer programs to control, for example, that robotic arm are not super trivial. But our brains evolved with this arm in place, and they control it very naturally. There's other things that are not very sort of intuitive. So, for example, cranes are very interesting. I don't know, like a boom crane that's got a long pendulum hanging on it. Crane operators take years and years to learn how to move a crane so that they can move the payload where they want the payload to go. So because each of those little sticks controls a motor, essentially. So you get in, if you're not skilled, you get in, you start moving the motors, you don't realize you're not really controlling the payload, you're controlling the boom. Okay, well, physics, in terms of physics, it's an easy problem. So you can put a computer in the loop and say, you've got this long pendulum, here's how that pendulum is going to respond, and then you can have the computer do that kind of stuff for you. But things like identifying patterns, learning, recognizing, and making decisions, and especially making ethical decisions, are things which I think biology and humans are quite a bit better at than computers at this stage. So I'm not sure how those limitations will really pan out in the long run. Good question, though. Yeah.
Turn to this side of the room. Yes.
Morning. My name is Rick O'Meara of Stockdale Center, Naval Academy. I suppose the bumper sticker for this question is, who does your ethics? And the idea there, I mean, all this innovation, as near as I can see from my work, involves or occurs in various layers of decision-making, bureaucracies in the government, for example. Very often you have a legal department, et cetera, et cetera. Who's deciding not whether we can do this, but rather whether we should do this in particular areas? Thank you.
John, do you want to take that one? At your level of vision in the system, up and down and sideways?
Well, we follow many of the same pathways that, for example, universities, academics do, whether it's using animals in research or human use research, is animal approval and institutional review board approval. So we certainly go through those same processes that anyone else does that funds research.
I think on the policy side, the history, for example, of armed drones in combat has produced a series of high-level decisions forced upon the highest level of the executive by events, essentially. Who's going to control under what rules of engagement? And the policies now seem reasonably well settled. I'm sure they've been thoroughly debated. But they were reactive to the technology presenting dilemmas that commanders and cabinet-level officials had never quite confronted that way before. I wonder if any of you feel that the federal government system, the Pentagon or the interagency process, is adequately aware of the ethical decisions that will have to be engineered as policy. For example, is return as deployed national policy endorsed by a president, or is it the principle of one ethical scientist at the upper middle level of DARPA?
Well, as mentioned, that's my guiding principle, and I would say that, you know, in the day-to-day operations, at least that I'm aware of, that certainly is the way that we do it. I can't say that we have debates on it. You know, is this an ethical thing to do? Should we do it, not do it? Some of these things are, it's not sexy, but fairly obvious.
Admiral Dyer, do you have any, from your past experience, any sense of where the military is in thinking about strategy and sorting through policy?
Yes, thank you. To our guest from the Stockdale Center at the Naval Academy, I would tell you that some of the best work that's being done in terms of the ethical questions related to robot employment is actually at Naval Research Lab. And much like DARPA, they're charged with looking into the future and helping us prepare for it. So there's active work, quality work ongoing with regard to the question of ethics. As a human species, sometimes we don't get it right quickly, but if you look at the history of chemical warfare or even nuclear warfare, you have to say that we do come to grips practically with difficult and very, very dangerous things at the uber level. That one doesn't worry me, frankly, as much as accountability. Accountability in today's world is in a very, very evolving state. In the old days, if you bombed the wrong target, we knew who to hang, and it would be the responsibility of that pilot in the cockpit. But in today's warfare, you have targeting information that's collected by the National Reconnaissance Office, that's processed at Langley, that's delivered as a set of latitude-longitudes that goes into a target mix that ends up with either a TILET or a UAV releasing a weapon to make contact with a target that is the product of this network. Gone are the days of simple accountability. And I think pragmatically that accountability will be a more difficult challenge than that of ethical ethos.
Fascinating. Another question from this side of the room. Yes, in front here.
John Prados, National Security Archive. This notion of technology, and I want to build on the first question actually. These notions of technology are all very attractive, but all of them rely upon, as you say, this machine-human interface, and we've got to provide for that. We build code. Now, humans create code, and writing code has been a basic problem from the beginning. We found this with air defense, found it with ballistic missile defense, found it with AI programs, and with building programs to play chess. Here's the question. There's going to be some void, some residual void that isn't covered by code in any program that we create. How dangerous is that residual unknown, and what can we do to reduce that void?
Stephen, you're the code writer on the panel.
Am I the code writer?
Yeah.
I'm the biologist, I thought.
Well,
no, that is a good question, but I still think that that gets back to what Admiral Dyer was saying, that it's crucial in all these stages to have a human in the loop, because humans are the thing that are going to identify that something's going kooky, or that the code's not working the way you had hoped it worked, or that there's some scene there that involves people moving around, but actually those are children and those are not children. So I think it's always going to be crucial. I don't even think until proven. I think it's just going to be crucial to keep sort of biological, the human element inside the loop to make parts of those decisions and make some of those identifications.
Can I ask you, you've had a monkey in the loop in a lot of your work.
Yes, in most of my work.
What have you observed about the monkey's relationship with your own experiments, if anything? Do the monkeys develop an attitude about their capabilities?
Well, that's interesting, actually. So there's, they do seem to become very kind of seamlessly involved in the game. So I think of like watching people play PlayStation, and watching doing the ski game, and they're always doing all this body English. Well, you just have to move the little knob. Moving your body doesn't really help you when you're playing the PlayStation. So we did an experiment where we were looking at the relationship between when you control things from brain signals versus when you control things from arms. And so the experiment was basically you have the monkey in the room, and for a little while he's controlling this thing by looking at it and thinking about it, and then we disconnect that and make him move his arm to control it. And what we found out was the monkey had gotten so good at controlling it with his brain that when we went in to unstrap his arm, he would kind of throw a fit. I'm like, I'm not moving my arm. So they do sort of get this kind of same engagement with the game that people do. Yeah.
Interesting. More questions? Yes, here.
Just following up on the question.
Would you identify yourself, please?
I'm sorry, Mike Rohrbeck. Just following on the question where we were looking at, the sort of the ethical consequences, and I guess the one issue that hasn't been discussed is, while we may want to be very ethical, the fact is we are not the only players in the game. I mean, we might consider the alleged attack of North Korea on a South Korean warship to be unethical or even an act of war. So I guess the question is, I'm not going to reflect back on, our reaction to 9/11 and torture and all that, but we are not the only players in this game. We may want to deploy or return them as deployed, but that may not be the rule of who we face on the battlefield. So I guess I am concerned about how do we play in that ethics game? How do we build those ethical considerations into this?
Anyone want to take that on?
It's the history of any military technology to give rise to that both offensive and defensive question that you raise. Electronic warfare is the classic one, where techniques that are developed to track are met with techniques that are there to jam, and then techniques to overcome the jamming. And it's a cat and mouse game going forward. To cut to the chase, I would tell you that safety, confidence, and victory goes to the nation that leads the technology.
Another question from this side of the room? Is there one? Yes.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consulting engineer and past chairman of Robotics International here in Washington. To what extent will acoustic sensors be used in some of these technologies in the future?
Acoustic sensors, sonar, was the place much of the robotics efforts in universities, certainly as you're well aware, started and developed over many years. Gone away from it for a period of time, and starting to see some return. Driven by economic factors, much like a small electro-optic device, small cameras, in that they're inexpensive and relatively simple to employ. So I think it has a role going forward.
Before I take another question, John, if I could draw you into the next panel a little bit, just looking at your presentations about your work on defenses in the biological space, whether they're natural occurrences or malign occurrences, and also the vaccination work that you've been doing. I think I understand as a non-scientist roughly the frontiers that you're cutting, but what I understand less is what the military has internalized as the lessons of their experience to inoculate, to anticipate potential threats on the battlefield, to vaccinate on the fly in the midst of heavy deployments. And to what extent is the work that you're doing, do you think, responsive to military needs in that sense?
Well, one of the attributes of the plant-based system is the speed with which you can respond. So one thing that I didn't mention is that with the system that we've developed, you don't actually, let's use the swine flu as the example. So for that system, you don't actually need the virus like you do in eggs. So with eggs, you need the virus, you grow the virus up, you inoculate it into eggs, and allow the virus to replicate in eggs and then pull the proteins out to produce a vaccine. With the system that has been developed under the AMP program, you just need the sequence, the genetic sequence, which can be transmitted electronically. And in fact, that's what was done once we had the sequence from the naval station in San Diego that picked it up. It went right into the tobacco-based system to start producing protein. So I think the number one thing, the approach that we've taken is speed and agility. So in essence, a strategic type of system that no matter what that unknown, if it's an unknown, that as soon as you can get it, as soon as you can get that sequence, and certainly DARPA's been active in the space of technologies that will determine that sequence. In fact, the one that was used for the swine flu in San Diego came out of a DARPA program, the early part called the Tiger system, that it goes right into the tobacco plants.
And thinking about the range of technologies that you presented, at least as I was listening, I heard virtually all civilian applications and hardly any that were only directed toward the military. Is that a fair characterization of what the outcomes of that range of work might ultimately be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything that I showed has a civilian application, global application, and again, that's on our shoulders, an important thing for us to do. To, I sometimes joke, but maybe it's the right way to think of it. Is we're a terrible market. If we want to attract a performer to develop a technology, we want them to win in the civilian space. So that ensures the availability of that for the Department of Defense.
Thank you. Yes, there in the...
Yeah, my name is Ed Newton. I'm a writer. Just to follow up on that a little bit, Mr. Cole asked Mr. Mogford earlier about future possible biological enhancements of soldiers in the field. And you responded, well, it's happening to a certain extent already with narcotics, and I don't really want to let that slide without further explanation. Could you tell me what's going on with narcotics?
Thanks. I mean, I was referring to the well-documented use of, and I can't think of the narcotic weed, but thank you, by the Somali fighters. So, that certainly should be and was taken into consideration for, when the weed was chewed, when the plateau of effect of the drug was, and when they were in essence coming down off their high. But that's a narcotic that instilled in them, a fearless demeanor. Maybe that's good in some circumstances and not so good in others. But yeah, that's the clarification.
Well, and I presume most of us who use some of these jet lag pharmaceuticals on our global travels are following pilots who were one of the reasons why some of these were developed. That's another kind of enhancement for pharmaceuticals.
I mean, my awareness with it for long duration missions, sure, there's been quite a bit of research into maintaining cognitive vigilance. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, in the corner there.
George Boyer, are there any concerns about the lack of ethics of, say, the private sector militaries as compared to traditional service branches who have a much stricter code of ethics than, say, a private contracting company, and applying these new technologies for their own benefit? I mean, is there a conflict between what appears to be just for like I hear about DoD research, maybe not necessarily? I haven't heard much about what private groups are doing in this field.
Right, in the movies, that's always the way it goes wrong, isn't it? And so you're the CEO of one of these corporations that we should be concerned about, I guess. So.
Well, there is in the world a bottomless pit of bad guys. And it is a requirement of society at large, both government and non-government, to discipline malfeasance. Peter Singer, who'll be with us, I think, later today, has a book talking about private armies. He would be a good person to pose that question to. But bad character and bad behavior has to be dealt with, has to be regulated, has to be disciplined in our homes. I'll spare you any teenage stories here. In our societies and in our businesses.
Well, and the implication of what you say is that in the end we resort to the rule of law. In a democratic context, we set laws and those apply to all citizens. And the question, I suppose, is whether we're going to be adaptive enough in thinking through the policy and and regulatory, to use a sort of pejorative term, frameworks around which these technologies are managed. It would seem that the government may confront that earlier than the private sector in some ways. But as the leader of a company that is in an emerging market in many respects, do you confront in the civilian applications of your innovations a legal landscape that makes sense to you? Does it need to get smarter, better? Is it adequate to address the issues that you have in bringing new products forward? Are there liability questions that are cutting edge that you're discovering one innovation at a time?
Certainly there are liability questions, and there are the question we had earlier today about what about code writing and mistakes that are written. There's a responsibility to evolve and to expand the distribution of the capability with your confidence in the capability. To use an aircraft analogy, basic airplanes of the 50s had no computers at all in their control systems, and among the many obnoxious qualities of an unaugmented airplane is what's called yaw oscillations. It wags its tail. Bloody sickening too, I might add, by the way. Then along came analog devices in early 60s where we said, you know, we could really make a little control system that would drive the airplane's rudder to counter that capability, and we could smooth it out, and we did. And then we did that in other axes, and then we said, well, gee, this could be an autopilot, and then we said this could do automatic landing, and finally automatic takeoff, and then you have full-up unmanned systems. I think the answer to both questions is to go from that airplane that wagged its tail in the 50s to today when you fly. You would probably be shocked to know how few of the landings you enjoy are actually undertaken by a person with hands-on control, even though he or she may be there. How few of them are taken directly as manual landings. So your confidence in that technology and your ability to manage it and deliver it safely evolves over time and is a product of good design and good test and evaluation.
Good. Let's take maybe one more question and then we'll turn it over to the next panel. Yes.
I'm Paul O'Day with the chemical fiber industry. Each of you are carrying out cutting-edge research in pretty impressive areas, but you feed off the national innovative and research base. And I wonder, as you look at that and work with it and plan ahead, how does that look to you in the context of research going on around the globe? Are we stable, moving ahead, falling behind? Are there holes? I'd be interested in how you see that environment that you have to rely upon so heavily.
It's a good question for each of you. How does your body of work look in a global context to you?
Well, for my presentation specifically, we rely quite a bit and stand on the shoulders of the National Institutes of Health. A lot of the groundbreaking kind of, less revolutionary type of work that's gone into being able to do that work came out of the NIH. Certainly, I think NIH is still a premier institute for biomedical research in the world, but I think data show that certainly the Chinese are growing rapidly. I would still take the NIH.
Stephen? Anybody else doing what you're doing? I had the impression that the Israelis had innovated in some of this originally.
There's, from the 4 groups who were doing this in around 2000, all of those have spawned students and postdocs who've gone off to do work. And in addition, there's also been kind of a gravitational effect, so the other labs that were doing similar work have kind of gravitated into this sort of similar neuroprosthetics work. I would say that there are some groups in Europe and in Israel in particular who are doing very well, and but I also agree that the Chinese have their eyes on this kind of work and would really like to pick it up. And there's a lot of brain power and a lot of resources there. So the likelihood that they will pick it up is pretty high, I'd say.
So Emerald, I assume robotics is maturing as a global competitive industry.
It is, and I'm concerned about the question you posed. There are global competitors behind, but global competitors in these areas in countries that have much more aggressive, much better funded and purposeful national industrial strategies. There are countries, to name one in robotics, a tremendous national efforts ongoing in South Korea to own this industry going forward. It speaks to this, what's the next big thing, what's the next drive of the American economic engine. On the, meanwhile, back at home, any public companies' necessary focus on quarter-to-quarter performance and the stock price in today's marketplace is counter to the kind of good investment you would like to see. Working against that tide, the work at DARPA and PackBot, by the way, the robot that you saw delivering the flowers early, is an example of a successful DARPA program. Probably no one started a fight here yet, so I will. I'm fixing to say something nice about plus-ups, congressional plus-ups. Companies like IRobot that started out with Rodney Brooks and 2 graduate students, Helen Grainer and Colin Angle, today's CEO and chairman, launched the company on a combination of credit cards and some congressional support. I think that in many ways DARPA is a venture capital company. You make high risk but potentially high return discoveries or returns on your money. Now, the hit rate, by the way, for a VC firm, let's call it 1 in 10. I've always thought DARPA's hit rate's about the same. Interestingly enough, the congressional, now there's bad pork, don't get me wrong, but there's also very, very good pork, good appropriations that fuel, in a venture capital sense, the advancement of technology in this country. And it worries me considerably that we are at risk of throwing out babies in bathwater.
Great. Please join me in thanking all the panelists for their excellent presentation.